Right then.
There you go, sir.
What? You're all wired up, ready to go. Good morning, and welcome to today's hearing on the status of Social Security's trust fund. Today, we will hear from Social Security's Chief Actuary about the findings of this year's trustee report. I first became chairman of Social Security in 2011, and I've held that hearing many times. At every one, I've said that Social Security is in trouble and its problems will only get worse. Back in 2011, the trustees told us that the Social Security Trust Fund would be exhausted in 2036. This year's report says the date is now 2034, 2 years earlier. If Congress doesn't act by 2034, Social Security will only be able to pay 79% of promised benefits. Also back in 2011, the trustees also told us that it would take $6.5 trillion to make Social Security solvent over the next 75 years. This year, the trustees tell us that it would take $13.2 trillion, more than double that amount. And as you all know, Social Security has been paying out more in benefits than it receives in tax revenue. To make up the difference, Social Security would use the interest earned by the trust funds from the assets that they hold. However, those days are now over. According to the trustees, Social Security is now paying out more in benefits than it receives from all of its income for the first time since 1982. This means we must now tap into the trust fund principal itself to pay benefits. Colleagues, this is a big deal and an important and signal that time is not on our side. The trustees' report is critical to providing Congress the information it needs to address Social Security's challenges. However, in 12 of the last 15 years, it has been late. Further, this subcommittee has looked into how the report is developed at past hearings. In addition, I know many were surprised to see the report not reflect the benefits of pro-growth tax reform that we see every day: more jobs, higher wages, and a booming economy. While historically, the trustees have been more rosy than others in their outlook on these areas, it's important to understand now and how and when the trustees make economic projections that are the key to the findings in the report. It is clear that the public trustees play an important role in the development of the report, and these positions were created to make sure there weren't any concerns with the objectivity and integrity of the report. Yet, we haven't had the benefit of the public trustees' insights since July 2015, when their positions became vacant. That's why I, along with my good friend Peter Roscom, chairman of this Health Services, or the Health Subcommittee, have asked GAO to look at how these reports are developed and why they are almost always late. Since we do not have public trustees, GAO's work can bring much needed transparency and insights into what changes need to be made to improve the process. Congress must be able to count on these reports and have them available so it can do what it takes to fix Social Security. Previously, I introduced my plan to fix Social Security permanently. My good friend from Connecticut, Mr. Larson, also has a plan that would fix Social Security permanently. Our plans are very different, but we both agree that we need to act, and act now, to fix Social Security for good. Workers and their families deserve the certainty that we've gotten Social Security on the right track. I know that fixing Social Security will require more tough choices that will affect the lives of millions of Americans. Congress has a responsibility to the American people to make these choices, and the longer we wait, the harder it gets. If we wait until the trust funds are exhausted, some options won't even be available anymore. We must take this responsibility seriously. Americans want, need, and deserve nothing less. I'll now recognize Mr. Larson for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And indeed, we do both agree that we need to act now, and both have put forward solutions that I think the American public needs to hear. Let me start with something that I think every member on the committee and every member of Congress, if they don't know, should know. 10,000 baby boomers a day become eligible for Social Security. If you look across this country and you understand that issue in and of itself demands that we act now and responsibly. Social Security is America's insurance program. It's something the public understands eminently. Why? Because every week, bi-week, or monthly, they look at their pay stub and see under FICA the federal insurance contribution. Let me repeat that again, federal insurance contribution, that there's a deduction that's been made. We often are here in the course of dialogue that government should run more like a business. In this case, it should run like an insurance business and be actuarially sound. And yet the last time that we actually addressed this issue actuarially was in 1983. Ronald Reagan was president, Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House. And they made the adjustments that were necessary that would extend the life of Social Security, but they didn't do it completely, and they didn't index. I ask anyone on the committee or in the audience, have any of your insurance policies gone up since 1983? There is no wonder why the system is in trouble, because it hasn't been actuarially adjusted since 1983. And had we, or had they back then, made those adjustments, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because it's indeed America's most outstanding insurance program, and something, as I said earlier, that everybody knows about, because no one has ever missed a payment. The Social Security system has never missed a payment, and both on the disability side, which is in more of a predicament than we are on the pension side, but nonetheless, both have to be addressed. So how do we address them? Well, we can do two things. We can either tell those 10,000 people a day that what they've got to do is face cuts. Or we can say to them, you know what we have to do? We have to make a premium adjustment. We have to do what should have been done in 1983 and index this program. So what we're proposing is that we do just that. And for somebody making $50,000 a year, it would cost you 50 cents a week, not only to extend the life of Social Security beyond its 75-year requirement, but provide the enhancements and benefits that people deserve, especially women in this country, and especially women of color, who more often than not find themselves retiring into poverty. All of these problems are fixable. Usually at this point, I have a Starbucks latte that I hold up anywhere that I go, and I ask the elderly if they know how much that is, and they'll go $4.50. Or if you were making $50,000 a year, that's 9 weeks of Social Security payments that would more than amply, as Mr. Goss has pointed out, pay for Social Security to make sure that we have enhancements in place for the 10,000 people a day that become eligible, and for future generations into and beyond the 75-year requirement, while still making the programs both on the disability side and the pension and survivors benefits solvent. This should be, as it was back in 1983, a bipartisan effort. And I think when you think about the fact for 50 cents a week, if you're making $50,000 a year, we can solve this problem. I'd love to have the American people welcome that debate with them so that we can arrive at a conclusion that I think is in the best interest of everyone. Social Security is neither Democrat or Republican, it's American.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, as is customary, any members welcome to submit a statement for the record. Before we move on to our testimony today, I want to remind our witness to please limit your oral statement to 5 minutes. However, without objection, all of the written testimony will be made a part of the hearing record. We have one witness today. Seated at the table is Stephen C. Goss, Chief Actuary, Social Security Administration. Mr. Goss, welcome back. Please proceed with your testimony.
Thank you very much, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Larson, and all members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to talk to you about the 2018 Trustees Report. And Congress, by the way, has received from the trustees every single year, starting 1941, this annual report as you have required in the law. I just want to, first of all, thank both of you in your oral statements for talking about the nature of the coming shortfalls that we have for Social Security, which we have so many years now discussed are really largely about the demographics, about the fact that our age distribution of our population is changing because of the drop on the birth rates back in the 1960s. It's like the tide and inevitable. But let me speak to you briefly about 3 major items that really are the changes in this year's Trustees Report compared to the last. First, based primarily on continuing lower than expected disability application and incidence rates through 2017 to levels that are now below the levels that we achieved at the peak of the last economic cycle in 2007. The projected reserve depletion date for the DI Trust Fund is extended once again by an additional 4 years from 2028 and last year's Trustees Report out to 2032, which is now very close to our reserve depletion date for the OESI Trust Fund. The DI reserve depletion date is extended to this degree in spite of the fact that disability incidence rates assumed by the trustees are now assumed to be rising more rapidly to the same ultimate rate as assumed in last year's Trustees Report. In addition, a bit of a technical point, average benefit levels for new disabled worker benefits are now in this Trustees Report projected to be somewhat lower due to changes in the mix of new benefit awards resulting from the progress that SSA has made in the last year on bringing down the administrative law judge hearing backlog. Second, the reserve depletion date for the OESI Trust Fund, the retirement and survivors separately, is projected to be late in 2034. This is a few months, just a very few months earlier than last year's report, which is projected to be very early, I believe, January in 2035. The change is largely due to lower projected revenue for the OSI, DI, and HI trust funds in the form of the payroll tax rates. And this is due to the lower than expected earnings as a share of gross domestic product in 2016 and 2017, based on the data we receive for actual receipts and Department of Commerce registers in their national income and product accounts. Also from assuming that a slightly larger share of the great shortfall we've had over the last 10 years in labor productivity, that is output GDP per hour worked by American workers, a slightly smaller portion of that will be written off as a permanent loss into the future. Even with this change, however, I would note that projected economic growth over the next 10 years is still faster over this next decade than most other forecasters. Third, the actual status over the long-range 75-year period is very similar to last year, with the USDI actual deficit that is the percent of payroll shortfall over the next 75 years, less than expected, and annual deficits in the later years lower than expected in last year's report. This is due largely to projected higher death rates, recent legislation, and improvements in projection methods. The USDI actual deficit was expected to rise from 2.83% of payroll last year to 2.88% of payroll over the next 75 years. However, the combined effects of all new data, changes, and assumptions and methods reduced the expected actual deficit to only 2.84% of payroll. If Congress were not to act, full scheduled benefits would not be payable at the point of trust fund reserve depletion, as we've discussed many times. Because program has no borrowing authority, however, continuing revenue to the OSDI program at reserve depletion in 2034 would still be, as Chairman Johnson mentioned, 79% of the cost of scheduled benefits. This is up from only 77% projected in last year's trustees report. For the DI program alone, continuing revenue would cover 96% of scheduled benefits at reserve depletion in 2032 if Congress were not to act. Not something we want to see, but just to give you a sense of what the magnitude of the shortfall would actually be. These projections indicate that the shortfall that needs to be corrected, with your help, thank you, is slightly smaller actually than indicated in last year's report. I look forward very, very much to any and all questions that you will put forth, and again, appreciate very much the opportunity to come and talk to you again this year.
Thank you for your testimony. We'll now turn to questions, and as is customary for each round of questions, I will limit my time to 5 minutes and ask my colleagues to also do the same. Mr. Goss, you reported that Social Security is now paying out more in benefits than it receives in revenue, including interest from the Social Security Trust Fund. For the first time since 1982. Previously, you estimated this wouldn't happen until 2022. What changed?
Thank you very much. Excellent question. What changed principally is on this is not on the benefit side. The benefit sides are very much as we projected last year, but it's on the revenue side. And the actual revenue, as I indicated in the oral testimony, that we have gotten in 2016 and in 2017, these are in the books now, have turned out to be less than we had anticipated last year, largely because the share of employee compensation and earnings as a share of gross domestic product in the country has turned out to be less than the early estimates from the Bureau of Economic Analysis last year. We've seen the same in our own numbers coming in for the amount of payroll taxes coming in, indicative of the amount of earnings that are subject to tax. They're just a smaller share by 2 or 3% of gross domestic product than had been anticipated in last year's trustees report. Now, the good news is that while we've seen that drop off in 2016 and 2017, we are assuming this is a temporary effect, and over the course of the next 10 years, we have our projections rising back up to the same share employee compensation of GDP that we have had in prior trustees reports. We're going to watch this carefully, but this is one of the principal effects that has really caused our payroll taxes to be lower over the next several years, which of course causes us to have less total income starting in 2018 rather than in 2022. The other effect is that the trustees have been very reluctant, as you know, to make changes in long-term assumptions. And for many, many years now, even in the light of having labor productivity, the amount of output per hour worked, fall much below the growth rate expected. We expect normally that it'll be 1.7%. It's been well below 1% over the last decade per year. The trustees have been reluctant to write off any of that in hopes that it would be coming back. But with the economy moving ahead so well as it is, and we still not see the labor productivity rising as much, the trustees, as most other forecasters have done well before them, had this year taken one small portion of that lack of productivity growth out of our long-term expectation. Out of our long-term expectation for GDP, that means that from where we are right now, the growth has to be a little bit slower going into the future. But as I mentioned before, our growth in GDP is in fact faster than virtually all other forecasters, even with a small mark-off.
Well, it seems to me that you've got a lot of accusations. I'd like to hear what you think we can do about it. Due to the tax cuts and Jobs Acts and all the good news that we're seeing with the economy, CBO and JCT have recently increased their projections of payroll tax revenue. Can you help us understand why the trustees' report's different from theirs, and when do you finalize the economic assumptions for each report? Was it before tax reform?
In fact, it actually was. So let me just share with you, what happened in this year's trustees report is that because of the rather lengthy process of developing the report, we actually, the tax bill happened very late in last calendar year. We had already had agreement amongst the trustees about what our short-range economic assumptions were at that time. We did, however, make adjustments to the projections for the specific, what we would call first-order effects from various items in the tax bill. I would note, however, that the trustees were well aware of the possible, what they would call macro effects, changes on economic growth, and the trustees plan on looking deeper into that for the purpose of the upcoming 2019 trustees report. Part of the reason that there was a level of comfort in doing that is that, in fact, the trustees' projected growth in the economy and GDP is, in fact, much in excess of many others. Just for example, even with the latest numbers from CBO, with them putting in effects from the tax bill, their average annual rate of growth in GDP between 2017 and 2027, over that 10-year period, in real terms is less than 2%. It's 1.95%. The trustees, even with the changes made this year, the rate of growth in real GDP is at 2.43%, about 0.5% per year faster than CBO. So even though CBO added something for the tax bill, they're still 0.5% slower on the rate of growth in GDP over the next 10 years than the trustees are. And of course, with slower GDP growth, you will have slower growth in the amount of tax revenue coming in, not only for Social Security, but for all other tax revenues.
You know, Mr. Gus, last year's report showed a major change with respect to when the Disability Insurance Trust Fund would be exhausted. That report showed that the trust fund would be exhausted in 2028. 5 years later than the trustees' previous estimate. Now that date is just 2032. That's a big change. You told us last year that you were looking at what is causing the decrease in disability applications. What have you learned?
I wish we could report we have a full understanding of what's going on. It has been quite remarkable. We reached a peak in applications in 2010, sort of at the height of the recession effect, and it's been dropping ever since. We've been projecting for the last 6 or 7 trustees reports in a row, as you have seen, that we would reach a bottom on the application and it would start coming back up at a point. That simply has not happened. Our applications have dropped steadily from 2010, where they were over 2 million a year for Social Security disability applications, to well below 1.5 million a year now in the year 2017. And I would share with you something not even reflected in this trustees report. So far in 2018, we are seeing further declines in disability applications. So there's actually even more good news to come. The level we're at now for our disability applications is actually even below the number of applications we had in 2007, which was the peak year of the last economic recovery. When the economy is operating at the level it was in 2007, we expect to have a big drop in the number of disability applications, and we did. But at this point, in 2017, we're even lower, and we are continuing to drop in 2018. We've looked very carefully at characteristics that might be affecting this. We've looked geographically, we've looked rural versus urban, we've looked by age and sex, and the application rates and the disability incidence rates are down across the board. So it's a little bit surprising. It's a wonderful surprise, and I would share, particularly for Ranking Member Larson's comments, we've done our best to get in touch with people in private industry, where there's a lot of private long-term disability insurance sold in this country, and we have heard because of proprietary information, they haven't been able to give us very specific, but they have indicated over about the last 4 years, they've been seeing drops in their disability claims rates as well. So maybe it's just some things in the water, and our society is feeling healthier these days. We're hopeful.
Well, have you learned anything? Have you figured out anything, or are you just babbling at us?
Well, what we have learned is that all of the things that we thought would perhaps be the explanation for this, the most obvious ones, do not appear to be that. There are a number of issues, and we sort of seek your advice and counsel and those of your staff about what your thoughts are. One thing that had occurred to us was there was a company named Binder & Binder, which had a lot of attorneys representing individuals for disability. They went out of business, as you know, a few years ago, and some people opined that, well, there's a lack of national advertising, so maybe fewer people know about applying for disability benefits, possibly. But we have come to understand that most of the attorneys working in that realm are still working in their local areas and perhaps doing local advertising. Some have suggested that might be even more effective than national advertising Binder & Binder did. Another possibility is that our administrative law judges have in fact been allowing a smaller percentage of the cases that they see in their hearings. As you'll recall, probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, it was close to 2/3 of all the cases that they saw were allowed benefits. Now we're down to nearly 1/2. That's a pretty big drop. We're not sure that that information has fully gotten out to the public and that in effect would cause people not to file for benefits if they felt they were really severely impaired and could not work. We sort of suspect not. So we are, I will have to be very honest with you, we are still looking very carefully and studying on this. We are expecting, I'm happy to tell you, for our Social Security Advisory Board to be putting forth a technical panel of actuaries, economists, and demographers to look at all of the assumptions that we work on. And certainly disability is going to be high on that list because of the surprising continued declines that we've been seeing. Our big question is, where will it turn? What will the year be in which it will turn? We've been projecting the turning point of applications going back up would happen in each of the last 4 or 5 years, and it simply hasn't happened yet. Now, part of it is clearly the economy. The economy has been strong, and there have been jobs available, and a lot of people are working. Unemployment rates are very, very low. Actually, the employment rate, the percentage of our population on an age-sex-adjusted basis that's employed, is now back almost to the level it was at the peak of the last economic cycle. Not quite, but it's very, very close. We're close to full employment now and approaching it. So certainly that has an effect. But as I mentioned before, the applications now are substantially below where they were at the peak of the last economic cycle. So clearly something very different is going on here. And we will look much more closely at it because when the applications will turn back up, assuming they will, is critical to this. As I mentioned before, at the reserve depletion date in 2032, with our ability at that time projected to be that we could pay 96% of benefits under our current projections, if things get much better, DI may not, in fact, deplete until much later than 2032.
You have another question to ask him?
Yep.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But first of all, Mr. Goss, thank you for your service. My grandfather used to quote Peter Finley Dunn all the time and say, trust everyone but cut the cards. We like to say, trust everyone but read the actuarial report. And I thank you for your reports, and I thank you for the analysis that you've done on various bills. And I know you've looked at our bill, Social Security 2100, and I would ask you, does that bill strengthen the Social Security Trust Fund so that it is financially sound throughout the 75-year projection period?
And indeed it does.
Thank you. We also, I noted in my opening comments that with 10,000 baby boomers becoming eligible today, this is going to put additional stress on a system that hasn't been actuarially adjusted since 1983. For given all the assumptions that you have to go through for a program to not be adjusted since 1983, I think any rational person listening to this anywhere says, well, wait a minute, have any of my other insurances gone up since 1983? And the obvious answer is yes, they have, of course, to adjust to the times, the changes, the economy, at all. And so that's why we included in this the opportunity to first correct the cost of living so that it actually reflects what people who are 65 and older are experiencing. Does that, with that provision, does that better reflect the cost for seniors if we were to go to a CPIE?
It would appear that we certainly could say that. The basic CPI that we use now looks at all urban wage earners of all ages. The CPIE, I think BLS is still referring to it as experimental. It's actually based on the purchases that are made by people 62 and older, essentially our clientele, and looks at their patterns of what they buy.
And do you have the data for the number of people, primarily women, I would add, who retire into poverty? Meaning that even though they've paid into the system because they, A, can give birth to children and are absent from the workplace, and because for every dollar their male counterparts were earning, they were earning on average 77 cents, we correct that program and create a new floor for Social Security that's 125% above the poverty level. Can you tell the panel here how many people currently receive Social Security and remain impoverished?
I think I'll have to get back to you on that. I don't recall the precise numbers off the top of my head. I do know that one statistic that's often mentioned is the degree to which we would have people who are elderly in poverty in the absence of receipt of Social Security benefits. But it's absolutely clear that given the level of Social Security benefits that are tied to your earnings levels throughout your career, if they were low, your benefit will be low. So we do have many people who are still working with total income under the poverty level.
We do, and it's tragic that so many of them are women, and even more tragic that so many of them are women of color. But what our proposal seeks to do is to both address that, to make sure that we enhance payments to people, the $10,000 a day that are becoming eligible, so that it helps them in their retirement, so that we actually have a COLA system that reflects the actual cost that the elderly incur, so that we also provide an opportunity for especially for those who retire into poverty, that the new floor becomes 125% of poverty. And that also, so that we can give seniors a tax break, because many of them continue to work after they've retired. And in doing so, as you're aware, we tax people who are single, who make over $24,000, and a married couple over 32 by indexing the fund and addressing that to $50,000 per individual and $100,000 per couple. 11 million Americans get a tax break. So by providing a tax break, by making sure that their COLA reflects what their actual costs are, making sure that nobody can retire into poverty, and still for the first time making Social Security solvent beyond the 75-year requirement, does this bill that we've asked you to review do that?
It does indeed. Both your and Chairman Johnson's bills would do that, and I'm happy to tell you that with the nature of the changes we have in this year's trustees report, we expect that your bills will be similarly successful under the assumptions of the 2018 trustees report.
I see my time is up, but I'll be back for a second round if we have it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Bishop, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Goss, for your testimony today. Mr. Chairman, I applaud you for holding this important hearing. I'm pleased to have recently joined this committee, and I look forward to working with you and Ranking Member Larson, as well as the rest of my colleagues regarding Social Security for all Americans. We have a responsibility to preserve Social Security for retirees, those who are approaching retirement, and for our children and grandchildren, so that they can count on Social Security. Millions of Americans rely on this important program to cover their expenses in retirement. Seniors and retirees have worked very hard for decades so that they can enjoy their retirement and receive the benefits they have earned. We must honor the promises we have made to those who have done so much to build our economy and who have earned a peaceful retirement. I've read the report, Mr. Goss. I find it as troubling as the rest of the committee does, and I'm sure the rest of the folks that we represent. I'm wondering, there's good news in this report as well, and I know you've covered it already, but in Tuesday's report, which showed that the Disability Insurance Trust Fund had gained 4 additional years of solvency when compared to last year's projections. It's nice to see some good news in this and positive news in the trustees' report. And I'd like to get your perspective on this, particularly as our economy is growing and unemployment is at a record low. Historically speaking, I know you've had speculation on as to why this is, but do applications for disability insurance go up when it's more difficult to find a job?
They do indeed. Applications historically, when we have a time of high unemployment, of a weak economy, we have an increase in applications. But interestingly, not only do we have an increase in applications, but the percentage of the applications that are found to be disabled and begin receiving benefits drops. So the increase in the number of people starting to receive benefits does not rise as much as the number of applications as you would expect. And of course, the counterpart of that is true. When the economy gets very strong and jobs become more plentiful, we tend to see fewer applications coming in. And we had anticipated that in the recovery that we've had since the Great Recession. What is so fascinating, though, is that the drop in the applications has been so much more than anticipated, even given the strength of the economy.
Thank you for that answer. After last year, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was signed into law. Our economy continues to grow. Americans are taking home higher paychecks. New jobs are being created. In fact, the CBO has estimated that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act will create approximately 900,000 jobs for the next decade. That's certainly great news for our country. In this context, it seems to me that getting more Americans into the workforce would provide an improvement to Social Security's finances. Can you describe to me the significance of all of the new jobs relative to the Social Security's solvency and their bottom line?
Well, new jobs, more people employed are absolutely critical because we are a pay-as-you-go system. All the benefits that are scheduled to be paid out are derived basically from the payroll tax contributions that are made by the workers of the day. The jobs are absolutely critical. I would share with you that it's interesting. You're correct that CBO is projecting a higher number of workers across the end of through the next 10-year period. The trustees also, compared to last year's trustee report, are projecting about 400,000 more people employed in 2027 than had been projected in last year's. But to put that really in a proper frame of reference, CBO is projecting between now and 2027 about a 5% increase in total employment, where the trustees are projecting a 7% increase in employment. So we're glad to see that CBO has sort of upped their expectation for workers, but the trustees actually, in this year's trustees report, have a higher growth rate in employment over the next 10 years.
What causes that deviation in conclusions?
It's really, and we had a hearing a while back with Keith Hall and myself comparing the assumptions and the projections that CBO is making versus ours. And the trustees, we have simply had, dare I say, a little bit more optimistic view on the recovery of labor force participation and employment over the next 10 years and into the long term than CBO and some other entities have had.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Prescott.
Mr. Gross, the Republican tax bill incentivized, apologize for that.
Close enough.
Incentivized the growth of pass-through businesses and moved the top tax rate on income earned from 39.6 to 15%. What impact will this have on the solvency of the Social Security Trust Fund? Mr. Goss.
There were actually a number of factors in the recent tax bill. As Chairman Johnson already alluded to, the trustees have not at this point taking into account sort of the macro or the dynamic scoring effects, and we'll be looking at that. The other factors that were built into the tax bill, which are the payroll tax changes, the pass-through, and the removal of the individual mandate, have on balance had relatively small net effects. Some of them would create a little bit more revenue, some a little bit less revenue. In fact, we project over the long term that the sort of direct or first order effects of the tax bill would be essentially negligible for the Social Security.
Well, then, Mr. Goss, you have different information than I have, and that's why I asked the question. Pass-through businesses, the growth of those businesses now with the incentive that I just mentioned, would contribute to the erosion of the payroll tax base, would it not?
I believe that is true, and we...
All right, let me ask you this question then.
And let me just answer that.
I'm sorry?
The information we built into this trustee report for the effect that we actually got from the Joint Committee on Taxation.
The information you built into it.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, let me ask you this question. Can you explain why the Social Security Trust Fund has reserves?
Thank you. We have reserves largely because in the law, the Social Security Trust funds do not have the ability, the capacity, the legal right to borrow. Therefore, it is essential in order to be able to pay benefits from one month to the next that we have some reserves to draw on just in case, heaven forbid, we ever have another recession or any other reason by which we begin to have more money paid out than we receive. We need to have a cushion. Usually the target that is desired is to have at least 1 year's worth of outgo as a reserve. The reason for that is just in case things turn bad for a while, we'll have enough time to come and talk to you all, tell you of this, and we'll have enough time to work out appropriate legislation to fix those shortfalls.
Mr. Goss, has Social Security ever failed to pay anyone's earned benefits? Ever?
No, it has not.
Thank you. Let me say this, Mr. Chairman. I like what Brother Larson put together in the Social Security 2100 Act for a number of reasons. H.R. 1902. It would solve the very problem that the trustees approached and which we will be trying to figure out, hopefully with some good hearings down the road. It would raise benefits, and I can't support any program that would instead cut benefits in order to solve the problem. So from the get-go, that's where I'm coming from. Your new report shows that Social Security will use all of its current income, tax revenues, plus annual interest earnings on its reserves and the reserves themselves to pay benefits for the next 16 years. The report notes that Social Security will have to start drawing on the accumulated $2.9 trillion in reserves to supplement current income and to pay benefits this year. I don't think, in my own opinion, that this is a cause for alarm, knowing the history. Rather than this was Congress's intent as part of the last major set of changes, financial changes that were made to Social Security in 1983. Drawing on these reserves has occurred periodically throughout Social Security's history, correct?
That's absolutely true.
So still we should heed the advice of the trustees and look at policy options that would reduce or eliminate the long-term financing as soon as possible. To that end, the threshold at which Social Security taxes phase out, to me, is too low. And Social Security is mostly funded by a tax on income from labor, a hard day's work, Mr. Goss, but not other forms of income, like the passive income from investments. And I intend, and many others intend, to do something about it. I yield back, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your questions. Mr. Buchanan, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goss, good to see you back. Seen you over the years. We appreciate your expertise and your leadership on a very critical issue. I represent Southwest Florida, Sarasota, Manatee County, part of Hillsborough County, Tampa Bay region. 229,000 people are in the program. I know how important it is to protect the viability of this long term. In fact, I heard a statistic that a third of seniors that get to start drawing their benefits have nothing but their Social Security and Medicare. So it's critically, I can tell you, important. I've done a lot of town halls. That's the realities. But let me just ask you, from a political standpoint, I don't see, and I want to compliment my friend, Mr. Larson, we've got to find a way, I think, politically to work together to resolve the viability of the program sooner than later. Is that your sense of it too?
I think we certainly agree with that, as do our trustees. Enacting something to make changes that will be necessary sooner rather than later would be wonderful. It'll give the American people an advance warning of what's happened. It'll allow you more options to consider, and it'll allow you to phase in the changes more gradually. Three big pluses.
Now, we've talked, I talked to you a little bit earlier. You said last time we made a change, we had to have our back against the wall. Unfortunately, that happens a lot here in Washington. Where's that time frame where you have your back against the wall? It seems like the sooner we deal with it, get something on a bipartisan basis, the better it's going to be, less onerous it's going to be. Some of those tweaks and adjustments they made during Reagan's years made a big difference to the viability long term. Is that your thought on that as well?
Absolutely, and we much look forward to working with any and all of you. We've much enjoyed working with Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Larson and their staff on developing plans, and if there are more plans to come, we're ready.
Let me, and I don't know where I read this, but I want to just see, I mean, this was put together in the mid-30s or so, Social Security. It's a great program, probably the best of that in Medicare. But let me mention, someone said if you don't die early, so to speak, before 65. If you reach 65, that the average person in America lives to be 85. Is that true? Is that, what basis are you making that? Because it seems to me, my mother-in-law was just in town. She's 99, lives on her own. She had a sister, 101 and 103. But just from the actual numbers, actuarial standpoint, how do you look at this? What is the numbers?
I think 20 years is very close. It's a little bit longer for women than for men. Women still have the advantage on life expectancy. And for our projections of mortality, we do this with great care. And as mentioned on some of the other assumptions, we make changes very carefully and only incrementally. Many people, you will probably recall, back just 4, 5, 6 years ago, were arguing that our changes in death rates that we were projecting were not projecting improvement fast enough. As it turns out, since 2009, mortality rates overall have been improving very, very slowly. Not our favorite situation.
Let me ask you a couple more quick questions. My time's running out, but COLA this year, they're projecting might be as high at 2.7. Do you think there's any sense it could go to 3%? I know that's an estimate for 2019.
Well, it's certainly possible. What we have in the trustees report here is we're expecting a 2.4 COLA this year.
Okay.
We think that's probably likely to be pretty good. We're going to have to pay attention to prices at the pump.
And then the other thought is Mr. Larson mentioned, and it's true, I hear 10 to 12,000 people turning 65 every day. In terms of the funding of it, what with the growth, if we had a 4% growth they mentioned the other day, but let's say we've gone from maybe 1.5 to 3, pick a number, that growth, lower unemployment, what impact, and one of my colleagues asked a question, but what impact is that having in terms of making the trust fund more viable going forward?
Well, absolutely. As mentioned earlier, the rate of growth in gross domestic product at nearly 2.5% in real terms over the next decade that the trustees are assuming, faster really than any of the private forecasters that we saw at the time we set the assumptions, and faster than CBO, definitely contributes towards the ability for our trust funds to retain their ability to pay full benefits timely.
That's why I'm kind of surprised when I hear they're going to spend more than they take in this year. I'd like to think that with the growth and the more jobs, it would offset that.
Well, the date at which we would reach that point has varied over time, just as the reserve depletion date over the last 26 years, the reserve depletion date has varied anywhere from 2029 out to 2042. Now we're looking at 2034, really because the economic cycles come and go, and so we're at a point, but it's not as I think was mentioned before, the fact that we're now at the point of spending more than we're taking.
Thank you. My time's up. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to submit for the record the Social Security Administrator's statistics on women, which is that almost 49% of all elderly, unmarried females receiving Social Security benefits rely on Social Security for 90% of their income. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Mr. Kelly, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Goss, for being here. We appreciate it. Looking through all this, and again, I think sometimes we forget where the revenue for Social Security comes from, and it is, of course, from wage taxes, or we want to call it Federal Insurance Contributions Act, whatever you want to call it. So it does become a math problem or a consideration. When I was looking at the totals of dollars that come in, payroll taxes make up for 87% of the revenue that comes into Social Security. Another 3% comes from taxes on benefits, and then another 9% on interest on that money. But what I'm getting down to is, so when Social Security was started, if you look at mortality rates, retirement versus the end of benefits being paid to somebody because they passed, what was the average mortality rate at that time when we were judging people and we were looking at that window? Do we know what that is?
Gee, the average mortality rate, especially for people who have...
We're about 79 years old now, right? That's about where it is today.
Oh, you're talking about the life expectancy,
yes,
the age up to which people would live. At the very beginning of the program, life expectancy at birth was much less than that. I believe probably even less than 65. But remember, a big part of that was because infant mortality was so high.
Right, right.
So what we usually focus on is life expectancy at 65.
Yeah, and I was looking at mortality rates, and there's been a decrease in white males especially. There's an increase in their death rate there, and a lot of people are saying that's due to drug overdoses, suicide, Alzheimer's, et cetera. I think a lot of that comes from the fact when we had an economy that was so slow, there's just something about the roles we play in life for men and women, and you look at it, and men have this idea that, you know what? I'm the husband, I'm the father, I'm the provider. When that's not available, I think it puts a tremendous weight on who they think they are, and they become very fragile in those types of things because they don't seem to have any hope. Now, the reason I bring that up is that if the real revenue comes from participation in the labor force, with the tax cuts and jobs bill, we're seeing more people get back to work, more people with more income, and more people contributing. That 6.2% by the person getting paid, and the 6.2% match by the person paying. We're 12.4% out of every paycheck, up to 128.4, I think it is. The more people we get into that, the more revenue we get. And so theoretically, I'm just trying to imagine, so if we have people, and I don't want this to happen, if people are dying at an earlier age, so that equation starts to bounce back and forth. And I'd like to, I know you can't tell me right now, but I would like to see going forward where we're going with that. Listen, I think Social Security is a wonderful program, but I also know where the revenue comes from. It does not, unfortunately, people think it comes from the government. Not one penny of it comes from the government. It comes from people who are working and the people who employ them. And if you're self-employed, as I am, or have been most of my life, you pay both sides of that. You pay 12.4% of everything. So I'm looking at this, just the raw numbers, and just talking about numbers and going forward. How do we continue these marvelous benefits to people when they reach retirement age and they have put in all their working lives? And for some people, this is the sole source of their income because they don't have much in savings. That's just the way it works. So I'd appreciate it if you can. Man, I watch this stuff, and there's an article that I'd like to submit for the record. If without objection, and this is in the trustees predict that Social Security will be insolvent in 16 years. This is a marvelous read for people just to look at so they get a more realistic understanding of what Social Security is, how Social Security works, who funds Social Security, and going forward, how does that model work? Because I think it's incredibly important for us right now, and we all agree. This is something we have to make sure stays solid. I want to thank you for the work that you do and your staff does. It's incredible work, and I just know that so many of our fellow citizens rely so much on Social Security. I think that tax cuts, Jobs Act, man, incredible. We're growing that economy really fast right now, and it's happening at a fast pace, and that revenue is going to continue to come in, and that's going to help out to pay these benefits. So thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. Mr. Rice, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goss, I've looked at your report, and I look at it as really kind of good news. I mean, the part about the survivor benefit is really not unexpected. I mean, it's the same thing as it was last year, just adjusted by a year, right? Yeah. And then the disability is far better than we thought, right? I mean, we thought it was going to expire in, what were the dates, and now?
2028, and yeah. In fact, just a few years ago, we were expecting 2016 until you all enacted a little payroll tax reallocation.
So, but the recent change, the recent extension this year of 4 more years of life in the disability portion wasn't the result of legislation, was it? I mean, it was just the actuarial factors were wrong, correct?
It's just the experience we're seeing in the program, and
I'm looking at here a graph of the disability applications and then the number of people in payment status, and looks like the number of people in the applications actually peaked, as you said, about 2010, but people in payment status have been dropping since 2014.
Exactly.
So you had 9 million people in 2014, and now you're down around 8.5 million. And if that continues to drop, this disability program is going to be able to continue on out further and further, correct?
Exactly.
And a lot of this is driven by the labor participation rate, and it looks like to me the labor participation rate actually peaked at about the year 2002, and then it dropped a little bit, but obviously precipitously in 2008 until about 2014. It leveled off, and it's actually starting to get a little bit better now, isn't it?
It is indeed. In fact, the employment levels are rising, have started rising even before the labor force participation rates did.
And so that wouldn't just help the disability. I mean, that would get people off of disability and provide additional revenue to pay the claims, but it also helps the survivor portion as well, doesn't it?
And the retirement portion and Medicare helps them all.
You said you assumed a 2.4% growth in GDP over 10 years.
2.43, yes.
Yeah.
A little less than 2.5. That's in real terms.
And CBO is assuming 3.2 this year, I think.
But on average, over the next 10 years, they're at 1.95%, about 0.5% slower than the trustees.
All right, so I know that as of the time I got to Congress, I think CBO was projecting about 2.9, but every year it went down in its projections to the point that it got down, I think, to 1.9 about 2 years ago. And since Mr. Trump's been elected, which way are those projections going now?
I think the projections have been coming up in the near term.
They've been coming up and increasing, not just in the near term. I mean, their projections over 10 years have been increasing as well, right?
They have.
And have the economic numbers that, those are projections, but let's talk about experience. The economic numbers in the last 2 years, have they been better or worse in experience than was projected?
I can't really speak to how they have done relative to CBO, but I think our projections have actually been right about on target for the amount of growth we've been seeing in the economy.
I think CBO continues to rise dramatically. Now, this projection that you didn't really take the tax reform bill into account, did it?
Well, it took it into account in terms of the direct effects. It doesn't have any sort of boosting the economic growth effects. But as I mentioned, our projection for economic growth is substantially faster as it is than CBO's and most private
I understand, but you didn't really take into account any increase in growth from the
We didn't put any additional growth on top of what we have for the macro effects of the tax bill.
Well, let me ask you, do you think the macro effects of the tax bill are stimulative?
Indeed.
So
yes.
If that's not taken into account, then your projections could actually be a little on the low side, and if they are, that will extend the life of both the disability and the retirement programs. Is that correct?
That could well be. And we'll see in the next trustees report. The one further thing we have to look at is the great slowdown we've had in labor productivity over the past 10 years.
And
the trustees feel they should take more out of future growth.
And if we can make further progress on our economic growth agenda in terms of merit-based immigration, infrastructure, trade agreements, all those things matter, don't they?
Immigration is a huge factor for the program and for economic growth, no question.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. LaHood, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm honored to be part of the subcommittee. This is my first subcommittee hearing. And Mr. Goss, thank you for being here today. I was hoping you could walk me through your process of creating the report and the average time it typically takes to do that.
Well, in working with our trustees and their teams, we will start working in the next 2 weeks towards the next trustees report. We actually formulate our recommended assumptions to the trustees in October through December of this year. They will be looked at and ultimately agreed upon. It then takes a fair amount of time for us to work through with all the assumptions we have to develop complete population projections for the country, complete economic projections for the country, and then all aspects of the Social Security beneficiaries and benefit levels. Our target date always is April 1, which we are required to target by statute for the trustees report to come out by that time, and we will do everything we can to get there, as we have in some years in the past. But as Chairman as Chairman Johnson indicated, we have not met that every year, and not recently.
Well, clearly this data that we get each year is extremely important. And from the oversight perspective, building off the chairman's request to GAO to bring more transparency to the process, I'm interested in your thoughts as to why this delay in submitting the report persists and how we can change that.
Well, I guess one thing that I would point to is that we do have a board of trustees, which includes 4 ex officio members of the cabinet, in addition to public trustees. When we have them, we haven't had for a while. So we have a little bit more complicated process in developing our projections than does, for example, the Congressional Budget Office, which works all under themselves without specific guidance. So we have to work with Secretary of Treasury, Labor, HHS, and the Commissioner of Social Security to work through the assumptions and methodologies we'll be using to get their approval and their acquiescence. But I would add, thanks to you all in Congress, you have required for many years now, I think since 1994, an actuarial opinion at the end of the trustees report. So I will just promise you one thing. If ever we are instructed to put something in the trustees report that we think is inappropriate, we will tell you in that opinion.
And beyond what you said there, are there any other barriers that you see that relate to this delay?
From time to time, as you all can imagine, getting a group of people together at a particular point in time in a particular place can sometimes be challenging by way of scheduling. And one thing that has contributed in the past to some delays in the issuance of trustees reports has been getting all of the members of the board together. We have quorum requirements, and we always, for the year in which we have a report and we're signing it, we have all of the actual members of the Board of Trustees there. Sometimes there are some delays due to getting the folks at Main Treasury on the particular day to have everybody sign.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Schweikert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hey, this is actually one of those moments I find joyful because I've found many of the conversations we've had fascinating. Just also for our own conversation, making sure I have it right in my head and also understanding of everyone else. The report, as I look at the last few years and skim through it, you actually are very disciplined, and when I say you as the report, in almost, I don't want to use the term slow walk, but you create a very, it's a perpetual horizon you're sort of designing to. I know we always say 75 years, but we'll explain the difference later. Okay, we're in this Goldilocks economy right now, but some of that isn't in the report because do we do something here to screw it up? But also demographics age. You seem to actually smooth out some of the charts. Is my simplified explanation of what you're doing correct?
Absolutely. We really try to, because our sense is that for you all who are going to make the decisions, the policymakers, if we were to react to every up and down in the economy and give you dramatically different numbers from one year to the next, that would not be a good basis. So what we try to do is sort of hit the midline on everything.
So in that same framework, particularly as we're all working on policy, there's things happening in our society that do have long-term cascade effects almost immediately. You've seen our recent birth rates calculations. If we as a nation are down to, what, 1.76, if that, and what's fascinating is that number seems to have fallen even during times of economic expansion, so we have to sort of believe that's our new normal. Can you give me about 30 seconds of birth rates? Because my little 2.5-year-old is functionally an annuity to pay my Social Security. We were thinking of calling her annuity, but Olivia is what we went with. I mean, attempted humor, but am I being fair?
You absolutely are, especially because we are a pay-as-you-go system, as several have mentioned. It's the workers of the day that will pay the benefits for the beneficiaries of the day. And when we shift from where, in the baby boom period, many of us were born then, where people on average had 3 kids, and now they're having more like 2 kids, maybe even fewer in the future, then where we used to have 3 kids in the economy paying in for every pair of elders, in the future we're going to have 2, maybe even less. That means
now,
we have a
my
greater
math
challenge.
is about a year old, but I was coming up with we were like 11 years or so from 2 workers for every 1 retiree. Sound plausible?
By about 2035, we will be there. And that's simply the outgrowth of the drop in the birth rates that occurred back in the mid-1960s. So this has been totally foreseen.
So for a lot of us, you know, we get giddy. We're in sort of this economic spike right now, but we also have to deal with other realities. Our birth rates have effect. Immigration, as we were all having discussions, has effect. The nature of that immigration, is it a talent base? Does it lean younger? Does it lean older? Apparently the demographics of what immigration is has huge effects on the stability of Social Security and Medicare. Our ability to, as those of us on this committee, to bring you a series of these things saying, what if, as we're working on a stabilization legislation for the future, you know, the chairman, the ranking member all have bills. I've had a fixation of sort of taking parts of their bills and seeing, could I ever design triggers? Hey, we're 15 years from now, birth rates go up. You could actually do certain adjustments, birth rates go down. We have a blended payroll tax revenues because, you know, GDP is not always exactly linked to payroll tax because some things in the economy can expand, but salaries and wages, our number of workers, labor force participation numbers sometimes are getting decoupled because of technology and other things. Is there a rational way for policymakers here, if we wanted to design that future stability that cures Alzheimer's tomorrow and all of a sudden we live 6 years longer, that's a huge stress in the system. Should we have a discussion of, if we're going to build that legislation that makes it so we never see that cliff again, how do you design slow on-ramps the same way you do your smoothing on your calculation, saying we're going to have to move the retirement age up. You might have to adjust what's taxed, those things. Do you have the capacity for us to bring you those types of ideas and stress them?
Absolutely. We would welcome all your ideas. We have many up on the web now. We have about 130 to 150 different provisions that we've scored for people in this room today and for people over on the other side of the Capitol. So we have lots of possibilities. In terms of raising the retirement age, there is explicitly at least one. There are several different mechanisms for indexing the retirement age based on increasing longevity in the future. But thank you so much for mentioning birth rates, which is really the much stronger driver on the cost of the program. And we don't really have a direct mechanism for changing the program to reflect
changes. But that could give you a much longer on-ramp because my little girl isn't going to be in the labor force for years.
For another 10 years, maybe.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Part of, obviously, the last question was for all of us to think about of using their good auspices to help us in the design. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. You know, the news from the trustees' report is clear. Time's not on our side when it comes to fixing Social Security. As I've said before, I believe that any Social Security solvency plan should meet the following principles. First, it ought to fix Social Security permanently, not just push out the trust fund's exhaustion date by a few years. Second, it ought to modernize Social Security to reflect today's workers and their families. Third, it ought to reward hard work. And fourth, it should protect the most vulnerable. And finally, it should improve retirement security. And with those things in mind, I think we can fix it, and it's up to the Congress to make tough choices needed to ensure that Social Security is here for our children and our grandchildren, just like it is for seniors and individuals with disabilities today. The American people expect and deserve nothing less. Thank you to our witness for your testimony, and thank you also to our members for being here. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.